Hello and welcome. I'm Allison Perrigo, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about biodiversity. This short lecture is intended to give you an idea about what biodiversity is, why to care about it, and what the major threats are to it today. This is part of a Formus-funded project, Vilda, which is intended to help children around Western Sweden learn more about biodiversity through hands-on experience. First off, I'd like to introduce myself. As I said, I'm Allison Perrigo, and I am the director of the Gothenburg Global Biodiversity Center. We're a center that focuses on biodiversity and is based at the University of Gothenburg. I'm also part of the Vilda scientific team, and my background is in systematic biology. Systematic biology is basically figuring out family trees for different species, understanding how they're relating to each other. And you can see some beautiful slime molds on the right there, swamp. And those are the creatures that I did my PhD on. In addition to being a biologist, I'm an absolute nature lover, and I really enjoy being outside as much as possible. On the left, you can see a couple pictures of me in my natural habitat. So I'd like to start off with a thought experiment here. You can go ahead and close your eyes and open up your imagination. Once you have that up and running, I want you to picture biodiversity. So whatever it is that means to you. I want you to picture a place where you're surrounded by it. And once you're there, I'd like you to take a moment to look up just ahead of you and think about what it is that you're seeing. Now look a little bit higher up, high up. And now down to your feet. And think about it a little bit. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What's close by? And what are the sounds in the distance? Can you reach out and touch something? Now take one more good look around you. Good stretch, left, right, up and down. And then slowly come back and open up your eyes. So what was it that you saw? Was it maybe a tropical rainforest with toucans and canopy trees and vines, some stick insects walking along the branches and ants marching at your feet? Or perhaps you were out in your summer house, out at the stuga. Were there wildflowers all around you? Maybe some of those you even know the names of now. Maybe you knew them before. Little ladybirds sitting on the middle of the flowers and the grass rustling in the breeze. Maybe crows in an oak tree. Or maybe you're underwater and you couldn't hear anything, except maybe, if you're really lucky, some dolphins in the distance with their high-pitched squeals. You were just watching the fish, some rainbow parrotfish or orange Nemo-style fish dancing around a reef. The thing is, regardless of what you saw, or even if you didn't close your eyes, you were still looking at biodiversity. Because biodiversity is very simply the variety of life on Earth, past and present. It's all around us, it's even in our homes, and it's really unbelievably varied and interesting. And the closer you look, the more you will find. So that's what we're talking about today, biodiversity, or the variety of life on Earth. I want to begin by talking about how we understand biodiversity. As humans, we like to categorize things. We like to understand them in a total sense and be able to put them in relation to each other. We like to put numbers on things. Biodiversity is no exception to this, and we have a number of different ways to quantify and understand what's out there. This means we can see it in many ways, but a downside of this is there's no one single tidy number that we can put on biodiversity. It isn't like measuring carbon emissions where it's easy to count tons of carbon. Biodiversity is a little bit more nuanced than this. Traditionally, biodiversity is defined at 3 levels: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. And I'll talk about all of these, and then I'll also talk about some other ways that we can measure or understand biodiversity. These include functional diversity and biomass. So the first and most zoomed in level at which we can talk about biodiversity is genetic biodiversity, genetic diversity. This is basically DNA. It's the sum of the variation in genes in all of the individuals in a species. It's why different individuals in a species don't look the same. It's why we humans look different. And genetic diversity is a very important thing because it allows a species to adapt during the process of evolution. Differences in genes can mean that some trees, for example, will do better when the days get warmer, while others might suffer. It can also mean that some flowers will be able to produce more pollen or perhaps be more spiny so grazers don't want to eat them as much. It's all these tiny little differences that can actually add up to quite a bit over evolutionary time. Generally, bigger populations have greater genetic diversity. So if you get down to 1,000 or 100 or 10 individuals, there just isn't as much variety there. And this can mean that species will suffer when it's faced with new conditions where it needs to adapt. So for healthy and resilient biodiversity, we need to make sure that there's a lot of variety within species. Generally, we don't know which genes will be needed in the future. So it's generally best to play it safe and have lots of options. The next level at which we talk about biodiversity is species diversity. And this, I think, is the most intuitive way to think about biodiversity. It's the number of different species that we find in a given place or community. In general, it's pretty straightforward because all you need to do is go out to your meadow or the forest and start counting each unique species. However, there are some difficulties in using species number as a measure of biodiversity as well. For instance, there's no one definition of species that scientists use. This is called a species concept. It's a set of rules saying what a species is, and it's something that researchers debate a lot. However, most of the common species that we know here in Sweden are pretty well accepted by scientists as unique evolutionary units, or species. But if you get down into some of the tiny fungi, for instance, it can be really tricky to draw these lines. So now we're up to the third level and we're really zoomed out. We're looking at ecosystem diversity. This is the big picture view of biodiversity. So what is it? An ecosystem is a whole set of creatures living in a space, together with the non-living parts of their environment as well. Together they produce a system, an ecosystem. These can look similar in a way, but each one is very unique. For instance, if you look at the three images here, you see some basic components, right? You see plants, you see water, rocks or mountains, and clouds in the sky. But the closer you get, the more you realize that each of these systems is a unique deck of cards that has different living and non-living components interacting. They've built upon each other, and they're relying on each other. Unique ecosystems exist both on land and in the water. If we think about coral reefs, for instance, that's a great example of an ecosystem. The corals build the reef. They're the home to many fish, animals, and algae, and they make up their own system. Here in Sweden, we have plenty of these marine ecosystems as well. For instance, the eelgrass flats. So ecosystem diversity is the total of all these systems. They're not interchangeable. It is the variation in the ecosystems found in a region or the variation in ecosystems found over the entire planet. Now, we've moved from the very small genetic diversity up to the very large ecosystem diversity. Within the scope of these three levels, we can account for all biodiversity, genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. But these three ways of looking at biodiversity make a common assumption that all biodiversity counts equal. But does it? Well, when we're looking at the roles that different plants and animals play, the answer is no. To understand this better, we have to think about functional diversity, which is the diversity of functions or roles that are found in a system. In some cases, we see what's called functional redundancy, which means that several species can be playing similar roles. Here we see this image on the right of the Hawaiian honey creepers, how there are different beak shapes for different purposes. Some are drinking nectar, some are snatching insects, and some are crushing seeds. If you were given the horrible task of deciding which two of these species went extinct, which I hope is not a decision that any of us will be making, would you pick two of them that do the same thing, or two that do different things? Hopefully you would choose two that do different things, because that way you're preserving functional diversity. Even though the same number would be going extinct, what they're actually doing within their system would be preserved. Likewise, we can think of some species that have very key functions in their ecosystems, such as bees. Their work in pollination is especially important for us, of course, or whales, which play a huge role in marine nutrient cycling by defecating or pooing high up in the water column. And this allows the nutrients to sink down and be used by lots of the other marine creatures on the way. Now, finally, one last way of looking at biodiversity. This is by biomass or weight. Just how much biodiversity is out there if we were to put it on some planet-sized scales. We call this weight biomass. It's literally the mass of biodiversity. And nearly everything you see out there is plants. 82% of biodiversity by mass is plants. I think that's pretty impressive. But it makes sense. Even though we maybe think about animals more than we think of when we think of biodiversity, there are plants all over the place. For instance, when you see this image here, the picture on the right, what do you see? The first thing that I notice is the sheep, and then I see the water. But the funny thing is, once you look a little closer, you can see that 2/3 of this photo is just plants. It's all green. And this proportion is actually pretty much in line with what we see on Earth. After the plants, there's a lot of bacteria. 13% of all the living things on Earth by weight are bacteria. And then we have 5% everything else. And that tiny, tiny, tiny little dot in the middle, that's humans. So even though there's close to 8 billion of us, we hardly even register on the scale. So where do we find this life? The vast majority of it is on land, and then a fair bit of it is below the Earth's surface. A tiny little percent, 1%, of biodiversity is found in the oceans. As a follow-up to this, it's interesting to look at a portion of that 5% of the total biomass that isn't plants or bacteria, the animal part. There's 7.8 billion humans and 70 billion domesticated animals on Earth. And we see this in the biomass. Of all mammals on Earth, 96% of them are either humans or livestock. That's things like cows and pigs. Only 4% are wild mammals. It's about the same for birds, where 70% of all birds are poultry. That's, again, the things we eat, like chickens and turkeys. Then only 30% of all birds by weight are wild birds. So that's all the seagulls, all the pigeons, all the parrots, all the eagles, all these things that we consider nature. So what does this tell us? If we look at things by biomass instead of by number of species, I think it becomes much easier for the numbers to show us what an altered environment we're currently living in, and what an important part of our world plants are. So if we go back to species diversity, if we start counting how many species there are, there's actually quite a few estimates of how many species exist on Earth right now. The guesses range from about 2 million to 100 million species, and the reasons the estimates vary so much are due to the fact that so many species are still undiscovered. So it's just that, it's an estimate. The other reason, much smaller reason, is the difficulty in deciding what is a species that I mentioned earlier. However, there's a study from 2011 that tried to estimate how many species are on Earth, and I think they went about it in an especially well thought through way. So while we don't know exactly how many species there are, I think this is a good estimate. They came to the conclusion that there's about 9 million species on Earth. Of these, about 6.5 million of them are found on land, and 2.2 million of them are found in the oceans. Then another major international report was released last year, and it used this number that they had come out with in this paper to try to predict how many species are threatened with extinction due to human activities. And they came to this very scary but really scientifically sound conclusion of approximately 1 million species at risk of extinction. So 1 million species, that's a lot. And no matter what way you're looking at biodiversity, that's a big number. So while you digest that number, I'd like to think about why this is a problem, why it's happening, and then where we need to look for solutions. Broadly speaking, I think we can break the reasons to care about these million species into two categories. The first is biodiversity's own value. Basically, that biodiversity should exist because we aren't so special as to decide it shouldn't. And the second reason is nature's contributions to people, also known as ecosystem services. The first reason to care about biodiversity is because it's special and unique. And if we move away from a human-centered way of thinking, then we can see that perhaps we shouldn't be having such a huge impact on nature, just because we can. In general, this way of thinking isn't especially appealing to people who think of profit first, but it does tend to be a popular way of thinking amongst those who've spent more time in nature and have taken the time to really appreciate how complex and cool it is. Nature's contributions to people, or ecosystem services, is another reason to care about biodiversity. This is basically what nature does for us and how it creates value. Some examples of this are pollination, climate regulation, and recreational value. I won't go further into it since I know Jenny Klingberg is going to be giving a talk dedicated to just this topic in the coming days. But still, regardless of why you think we should conserve biodiversity, it's declining really, really quickly. And if we look at the services that it provides for us, 14 out of 18 of those have decreased in the last decade. So yes, much like for climate change, things aren't looking really great for biodiversity at the moment. But I want to stress that it isn't all over yet. Biodiversity is declining, but it is not gone. There's still quite a bit left, and it has an amazing ability to rebound. So we need to know what to do with what's left of it. And on that note, I'd like to talk about why it's decreasing. So I like to think about this like we have a giant bucket of water. Right now, we have a lot of holes in that bucket. You can see that bucket is filled up to the top, but it's leaking quite a bit. The holes are getting bigger every day, and the water is pouring out. So what do we do about this bucket with all the holes in it? Is the solution to start pouring more water into the top? Well, you could, but as long as there's still holes, it won't really solve your problem. And this is the exact same for biodiversity. It's declining really, really fast, so we don't need to increase it, we need to stop decreasing it. We need to stop the drivers of biodiversity loss. And this may be the biggest take-home message I want you to have with you today. We as a society need to focus on slowing or stopping biodiversity loss. So what makes the holes bigger? That same report from last year that told us that 1 million species are threatened with extinction, it also listed the top drivers of biodiversity loss. And this is great bad news, because now that we really know what the problem is, we can actually move ahead with fixing it. So the number one driver of biodiversity loss is changes in land and sea use. About 70% of non-ice covered land is exploited by humans in some way right now. About half of this is crops and pasture land. Water is being rerouted to grow crops like cotton. Rainforest is being cut down to grow feed for animals that we will eventually eat. And the oceans are being changed as well. Mangroves are being removed to make spaces for hotels, for example. The second biggest driver of biodiversity loss is the direct exploitation of species. And this includes activities like hunting, both for livelihoods and for sport. And it also includes, for example, cutting down hardwood trees to make furniture. In the ocean, it includes fishing large fish that don't reproduce fast enough to keep their population stable. So now we're moving on to issue number 3, which is climate change. Climate change is not the biggest issue right now for biodiversity loss, but it is a big issue nonetheless, and it is growing fast. We need to remember that climate and biodiversity are not the same thing, and they have different drivers and different solutions. So saving biodiversity isn't only about keeping oil in the ground and slowing climate change, although we certainly need to do that as well. As far as biodiversity is concerned, we already see the effects of climate change on, for example, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. I'm an avid diver, but I haven't been there, and I don't think that I will ever see that reef looking how it did just 10 years ago. That's a direct result of climate change, and it's something that happens very, very fast and has devastating effects. Past these three, we can count invasive species and pollution as other top drivers of biodiversity loss. I won't go into them now for the sake of time, but they're also really important human-driven actions that have a very big impact on our biodiversity. And I think a lot of you have probably been working within the Sustainable Development Goals quite a bit when you're thinking about your teaching, even in everyday life. And I really like this picture of the Sustainable Development Goals, this visualization of them, because it shows the biosphere. We have life on land and life below water really as the basis for everything else. And I think this is important to think about because the biosphere gives us a lot. It contributes quite a bit to society, and it's something that drives everything else that's going on. But at the same time, we have a much bigger effect on it than it does on us. So we need to keep that responsibility in mind, that this is a loop and that all these things are very interconnected. And sustainability in one area is really connected to sustainability in others. So this is where we are. It's not a very pretty picture, but it's what's going on right now. And now that you know the issues that we're facing, and you can think about them in your daily life as well as in your teaching. So there's no single thing we need to do to fix this problem, but spreading awareness that there is a problem and also that it's something to care about is a very positive step towards transformative change that we need to address this loss. The quote I have here was a lead-in to a big scientific article that came out last year, and I think it frames it really nicely. For decades, scientists have been raising calls for societal change that will reduce our impacts on nature. Though much conservation has occurred, our natural environment continues to decline under the weight of our consumption. Humanity depends directly on the output of nature, thus this decline will affect us all, just as it does the other species in which we share this world. As I said before, it's late, but it's not too late. We need to appreciate nature for what it is and what it does for us. And to show this appreciation, we must reduce our impact. So we hope that Vilda has taken you and your students closer to nature and given you a better appreciation for our Swedish meadows, the pollinators, and the soil, and what can grow with just a little bit of effort and care. And with that, I would like to say thanks for your attention. Thank you for participating in this project as well, in order to bring information and a passion for biodiversity to the next generation. If you're interested to hear more about the Gothenburg Global Biodiversity Center, along with ongoing research and initiatives in Western Sweden, you can find us on Facebook or sign up for our newsletter. Also, don't forget to find and follow Vilda on Instagram, if you don't already, for project updates, pictures, and stories.